You're here, listening, in the dark, I guess. I'm not sure if I should tell you these stories, but since you're already here, tell me, where are you right now? And what time is it there? Leave it in the comments. I hope you're not alone, because, after this, you might wish you were. It had started on a Monday. The kind of Monday that didn't feel wrong, just distant. A heavy stillness had pressed against the sky. The air had been soaked in a strange hush. By 3 a.m., the house had already emptied. The parents had left for work in silence. Boots on gravel, the low hum of an old engine, and then nothing. The porch light had flickered once. Then the darkness had claimed the driveway again. He had always liked those early hours. Time to breathe, time to sit, time to feel the world before it began spinning too fast. By 6:20, the porch steps had creaked under familiar weight. A school bag had been settled against the knee. The horizon had begun to pale, not bright, just hesitant. Then the bus had arrived. Earlier than usual, no sound had warned of its approach. It had simply appeared. Its color had been the same faded yellow, its size unremarkable, but something about it had felt unfinished, as if it had been drawn hastily from memory. No route number had been displayed, no identifying marks, no familiar squeaks or groans. The door had opened with a hiss that hadn't echoed. And then he had been seen. The driver, older than most, pale, not from age, but from something deeper. His clothes had been ordinary, work-worn, familiar, but his expression had not moved. A blank face, wrinkled lightly around the mouth, but stretched tight at the eyes. Eyes too dark, too still. He had worn them like borrowed glass. The boy had climbed aboard. The floor beneath his shoes had felt cold, too clean, too quiet, and the seats, they had not groaned, they had not shifted. Other students had already been seated, but no chatter had filled the air, only glances quick, uncertain, empty. The driver had watched through the overhead mirror, not turning, not blinking. A few words had been offered, casual phrases, hollow sounds. But they had not landed, they had not lived. They had simply hung. The bus had pulled away. The road taken had not been the usual one. Familiar streets had been passed by. New ones had appeared, unnamed, unremembered. The students had begun to stir. Small whispers had been traded between them. Questions with no weight, worries with no spine. But the fog had started before answers could take shape. It hadn't rolled in, it had grown. Inside the bus, visibility had vanished. The windows had grayed out, like breath on glass. Even the front windshield had become opaque, and yet the bus had continued to move. The engine had hummed steadily. The vibrations beneath the floor had felt too even, as if the wheels were no longer touching earth. Then the sounds had changed. First, soft crying, next the tinkling of broken glass, and then something far worse, something wet, something tearing, like muscle being unraveled by teeth, like bones being folded in ways they weren't meant to bend. The back of the bus had remained still, but the air had grown thick with heat and metallic scent. The sound of flesh being entered and removed had layered the silence. Someone had begun screaming, and then someone else had stopped. The fog had begun to retreat, but not outside the windows, inside the bus. What it left behind had not resembled a classroom commute. It had looked more like a massacre. Seats had been torn, not cut, ripped. Metal poles had been bent at inhuman angles, and the smell, it had bloomed from every surface. Red had coated the windows. Thick, smeared handprints dragged across the glass. Chunks of something unidentifiable had clung to the ceiling. Teeth marks had been pressed into seat backs. Bodies had lined the aisle, not sprawled but placed, arranged. Heads missing, limbs shredded. None of it had looked quick. There had been no sound but the engine, and the driver had still been driving. His face had remained unchanged. But his shirt, his skin, his hands had not. Crimson had drenched him, thick and dripping. His eyes had found the mirror once again. They had locked, not in curiosity, not in panic, but with certainty. The boy had tried to speak, but the words had failed. His jaw had moved, but no sound had followed. Only the weight of his breath in his throat. The driver had continued to stare, and then the bus had stopped. Not at the school, not at any place that could be mapped. It had stopped at the edge of nothing. Fog had risen again, this time from the ground. No road had remained beneath the tires. Only gravel, cracked dirt, and stillness. The boy had stood, legs weak and hollow. A single step forward had taken all his strength. The aisle had been soaked in red, and through the blood, pieces of cloth and bone had floated like leaves. The smell of copper had clung to his tongue. His feet had stumbled over something warm. Not a body, not anymore. Just a rib cage open like a broken bird cage. Then the driver had spoken, but not with voice, with mind. The words had been delivered, not spoken, pressed into the skull like a hot coin into wax. The message had been simple. I have a curse. But it hadn't sounded like regret. It had sounded like a sentence already certain. I feast on children under 20. That had been the second truth. The first had already been witnessed. Then came the third. I chose you to be next. Not as a victim, as a successor. Tears had filled the boy's eyes, but they hadn't fallen. The air had been too thick. Grief had no room to grow in terror. The driver had begun to cry. But the tears had not asked for forgiveness. They had spilled with the weight of inevitability. The ritual had been completed. And then he had vanished. No shimmer, no sound. Just absence, dense and immediate. The seat had remained warm. The steering wheel still wet with blood. But the space had emptied. The boy had been left alone. But the bus had not waited. It had moved, without a driver, without mercy. The steering wheel had turned itself, jerky at first, then steady. The engine had growled louder, as if waking up from sleep, and the road had changed. It hadn't been made of gravel anymore. It had stretched endlessly, pale and wet, like bone. The trees lining either side had leaned inward, their branches gnarled, bark darker than night. The boy had tried to scream, but the sound had caught somewhere between ribs. His lungs had filled with pressure, not air, as though something inside had been taking over. The windows had remained shattered. Blood still dripped from the ceiling, thick and fresh. The fog had pressed against every crack. No wind had touched the broken glass. And yet, the air had begun to shift. Heavy, warm, hungry. The seats had started to move. Not slide, breathe. Leather expanding, contracting, as if the bus itself had lungs. Something had begun crawling under the floorboards. Not mice, not rats. Too large, too deliberate. The sounds had been wet, dragging, sticky. The boy had backed into the farthest corner, hands shaking, eyes darting. He had not cried. There had been no time. Memories had started to fracture. The face of his mother distorted. His bedroom stretched and curved like melting wax. His own reflection missing. The rear-view mirror had twisted. It had pointed downward now, toward him, and within it a new figure had formed, wearing his clothes, but not his expression. It had smiled, not warmly, but knowingly, a grin carved from something older than joy. The figure's eyes had been hollow, black voids, framed by pale, pulsing veins. And in those voids, the driver's sorrow had returned, but it had been his now, inherited, absorbed, bound. The bus had begun to speed. trees had blurred into smears of color. No horizon had waited ahead, only white. A blinding, endless fog swallowing the world. The boy had reached for the window. The broken edges had bit into his skin, but the pain had been distant. His body already shifting. He had felt it under the skin, the rearrangement, the inheritance. Bones lengthening, veins thickening, a second heartbeat waking inside his chest. And when the bus had swerved, his body had not resisted. It had obeyed, as if it had driven itself. The front of the bus had collided with something massive. Not a tree, not a wall, but a darkness so dense it had refused to move. And everything had gone black. But the darkness had not been death, it had been arrival. Consciousness had returned slowly, not like waking from sleep, but like rising through something thick and unwilling. A syrup of memory and noise. The air had smelled different, colder, wetter, and beneath it, something sour, metallic, feral. The boy had remained on the floor of the bus, but the bus had changed. The walls had pulsed with a faint light, as if veins had grown through the metal. The seats had been empty, no blood, no flesh, just shadows where bodies had once sat. The windows had shown no road, only darkness shifting like water. Then the whispering had started. It hadn't come from outside. It had come from inside his skull, 1,000 voices, none his own. They had whispered names, memories not lived, regrets not earned. They had spoken of hunger, not for food, not for blood, but for continuity. The curse had not been punishment, it had been a cycle, a role, a throne passed down. The boy had not been spared, he had been chosen. The mirror in the front of the bus had shifted. It no longer reflected him. It had shown a new driver, pale skin, wrinkled lips, blank expression. The same steel-toed boots, the same camo hat, but with new eyes, his eyes, and he had smiled. The wheel had turned beneath his fingers, not guided but embraced. The engine had roared awake once more, and the fog had parted, ready to receive. Another road had appeared, flat, endless, waiting, and at the end of it, a lonely house, a porch, a child, a school bag resting on tired knees. The new driver had leaned forward. His hands had rested calmly on the wheel. The door had hissed open without sound, and his eyes had locked onto the next. A new name, a new age, a new vessel. The bus had moved forward, not fast, not slow, just inevitable. And somewhere, deep in the frame of the bus, something had started whispering again, not in fear, but in welcome. Camping had always been a sanctuary. The smell of pine, the hiss of fire, the sky, a vault of stars, offering peace without questions. Until that night, when the stars had watched back. The trip had been planned with care. A winter break escape, 4 days, 3 nights. The park had promised solitude, the forest, quiet, and the company, familiar, trusted. 5 had gone in. Their laughter had echoed along the trailhead. Gear had been divided, roles assigned. Optimism unquestioned. The hike to the campsite had cut through a hush of bark and moss. Birds had scattered with each step, unaware of what approached. A small clearing had been chosen, far from the main trails. A pocket of safety, carved by trees. Tents had risen beneath branches. The fire had crackled into dusk. S'mores had melted, embers had danced. The night sky had stretched above them, infinite. And then the question had been asked, if eyes could look out, couldn't something also look in? The words had passed like smoke. Laughter had covered the fear. But fear had heard it, and it had listened. Later, sleep had swallowed them, but not all had drifted off. One pair of eyes had remained open, gazing upward, admiring. Two stars had burned brighter than the rest, steady, unflickering. The air had grown cold, not winter cold, watchful cold. The tent had rustled, but no wind had stirred. When the stars had vanished, it hadn't been the clouds. They had been snuffed out, and then returned, closer, sharper, aimed. The silence of the forest had become weighted. The crickets had stopped. The owls had gone quiet. Only the sound of breath had remained. Morning had broken without fanfare. The coals had glowed faintly under ash, and breakfast had sizzled beside unease. One by one, the group had emerged, faces flushed from sleep and cold. Laughter had returned, but thinner, eyes darting too often toward the tree line. The hike had followed, 20 miles of forested trail. Markers had counted the distance. Snacks had fueled each mile. Stories had softened the silence. But the man on the trail had broken the rhythm. Old, alone, a shadow moving through sunlight. Pleasantries had been exchanged, but his eyes had lingered. The group had laughed. A joke about creepermen had followed, but the name had hung in the branches long after they'd passed. Lunch had come beneath heavy canopy, pines towering above like silent sentinels. The shade had deepened, the air thickened. Shadows had danced without partners. The rest of the hike had blurred. Jokes had quieted, energy had faded. Feet had dragged, eyes had narrowed. By the time camp had been reached, the light had already died. Burgers had filled bellies. Fire had warmed cold bones. But something had been missing. Safety. That night, the stars had returned. Too many, too close, too still. And in their center, two lights that had not belonged. They had not twinkled, they had glared. Unmoving, unblinking. Not stars, but sentinels. He had watched them from inside the tent. The rain cover off, the fabric thin. Nothing had separated him from their gaze. Sleep had been denied. Not by noise, but by attention. Each time his eyes had closed, the warmth of their stare had pressed harder. Each time they had vanished, they had returned somewhere closer. And in that final moment, before turning away, he had realized they weren't just above. They had been around, in the trees, in the gaps between stars. A canopy of watchers, silent, patient, endless. The morning had not arrived with color, only gray, only wind. The fire had sputtered to life once more. Shadows had returned to dance. Sam had greeted the flames with laughter, but even his voice had carried hesitation. Something had shifted in the air. Breakfast had been eaten quickly. Hands had fidgeted, eyes had wandered. No plan had existed for the day. The lake had called to some, the trail to others, and for two a path had been chosen, not marked, not cleared, just a line of instinct into the trees. They had followed creeks, leaves, wind, traces of life still untouched. For a time, nature had comforted, the babble of water, the rustle of paws, and then the quiet, not silence, but absence, as if the forest itself had stopped breathing. Birds had vanished, squirrels gone. The deeper the trees became, the more dead the woods had grown. A clearing had formed without warning. Twisted trees had circled it like a ring. No wind had reached its center. No sunlight had pierced its crown. And somewhere between one step and the next, Sam had vanished. No noise, no warning, just empty space. Panic had rushed in. Breath had turned ragged. The knife had been drawn. Instinct, not courage. Movement had shimmered near the tree line. Not a figure, a shift. A flicker of light, not from above, but within. A flashlight had been seen, resting in the dirt. Too old, too clean. It had pulsed faintly, a lure carved from hope. or bait. Each step closer had chilled the air, not colder, but hungrier. Frost had gathered on fingertips, and when the light had gone out, so had everything else. No color, no sound, no direction, only them. They had returned, the eyes, no longer distant, no longer above. They had filled the sky. Each one had opened slowly, white, burning, eternal, and each one had chosen. No sky had remained, only eyes, layered, staggered, watching. Some had blinked, but most had simply stared, fixed upon the clearing, fixed upon him. Breathing had grown difficult, not from fear but from weight. Each inhale had scraped, each exhale had chilled. The air had thickened around him, like mist with purpose, with intelligence. The trees had begun to lean, their trunks pulling inward, branches stretching, listening, waiting. In his palm, the knife had trembled, not from weakness, but resistance, as if it had felt the gaze too. And then, sound had returned, but not from the forest, from the sky. A low hum, like a choir with no mouths, a tone that vibrated in the bone, ancient, untranslatable. A fog of light had spread across the roots, pale, iridescent. It had moved like water but thicker. When it touched his boots, the leather had steamed. Frost had cracked along the sole, but no pain had followed. The eyes had opened wider. Their glow had grown unbearable, not bright, but revealing, as though every cell had been laid bare. Then it had come, a silhouette from the void between trunks, tall, impossibly thin, limbs too long, torso too still. No face had been seen, only the absence of one. And yet it had smiled. The fog had risen to his knees, cold without temperature, weightless but heavy on the chest. The figure had stopped at the edge of the clearing, its outline shifting with the trees behind it, like it had been drawn using shadows. Around it, the forest had bent inward. Reality itself had thinned. The wind had reversed. Time had faltered. From above, the eyes had blinked in unison. The hum had risen in pitch. Pressure had collapsed into the lungs, and something ancient had entered. Not possession, not control, but knowing, truth, pressed into the marrow. He had not been chosen at random. He had returned. This place had remembered him, even if he hadn't remembered it. The roots had begun to move, not toward him, but around, coiling, preparing, marking the soil with symbols never learned. A ritual had begun, without language, without fire, only stillness and gaze. And from the edge of the clearing, another figure had stepped forward. Shorter, slighter, familiar, eyes glazed, clothes torn. Sam. But not Sam. Not anymore. The light behind his eyes had been replaced. What stood before him had been a copy. Its skin had worn Sam's shape, but the joints had moved wrong. Each blink had been delayed, each breath artificial. The figure had mirrored his stance, hands twitching in rhythm, head tilting slightly too far, as if learning how to wear him. And the forest had accepted it. Branches had ceased to sway. The fog had parted at its feet. The eyes above had dimmed. The clearing had pulsed with heat, not warmth, but fever, a friction between two selves. And he had stepped forward, not by choice, not by will, but by design. Their gazes had met, one real, one rewritten, and something inside had cracked, the memory of laughter. The imposter had opened its mouth. No words had emerged, only silence in the shape of a scream meant to replace his own. His knife had remained raised, but his hand had lowered. The will to fight had been unmade, because the forest hadn't needed war. It had needed inheritance. His body had gone numb, not from fear, not from cold, but from surrender. He had understood then. This place didn't kill. It copied, replaced. One would leave the forest, one would remain, and the world outside would never notice. A final blink, a final breath, and then darkness. The group had been seen again. Later that evening, emerging from the forest trail, tired, quiet, unchained, Sam had walked beside him, smiling, calm, eyes reflecting no light. The others had joked, teased him for wandering. He had laughed, he had nodded, but his voice had sounded off. No one had questioned it, not then, not that day, not even when his reflection stopped matching his expression. They had returned to their lives, to routines, to families. Only one of them had brought something back, or rather, had been brought back, and when the stars appeared that night, he had stared up at them again, not in awe, but in recognition, because they had always been eyes, and now, so were his. It had started with a voice, sharp, familiar, condescending. Get up, we're not in primary school. And then, laughter. A desk had pressed against his cheek. Drool had dried against his wrist. Around him, faces had blurred, students, shadows, shapes. The teacher's stare had pierced through them all. He had tried to speak, but the name had vanished, like smoke in the back of his throat. You forgot your name? The tone had cut. Out of my class. Laughter had returned. Not warm, not real. Something in it had echoed wrong. His legs had moved. The door had opened. The hallway had swallowed him. And then the hallway had stretched. Lockers had warped. Light had pulsed overhead in a regular rhythm, like blinking eyes too tired to stay awake. Time had softened. The stillness had felt staged. And then motion. A man in a gorilla suit had run past. No sound, no explanation. No one else had noticed. Moments later, a cow had followed, clumsy, wide-eyed. Its costume had been stained red. The cow had stopped, then turned, slowly. Its plastic eyes had locked onto his. You need to kill the gorilla. The voice hadn't matched the suit. It had echoed inside his skull. You get to choose what happens. The cow had walked away, not hurried, not afraid, just inevitable. He had followed, not with purpose, but with weight. Each step had felt distant from his own body. The teacher had reappeared, louder now, closer. Where are you going? A sudden jolt, fear returned. His mouth had stammered. I was following the cow. Silence. No more games. Go to the head office. Now. He had turned. The cow had disappeared. The corridor had grown colder. Footsteps had not echoed. And yet, cow prints had stained the floor. Bright red, leading away from the expected path, toward the disabled restroom. The door had creaked open on its own. The smell had hit like a wave. Rot, dampness, something artificial, layered on decay. Inside, the light had flickered, but not from above, from within, as if the walls had been breathing. The stall door had been ajar. Beyond it, a toilet had overflowed. Paper spiraled like roots from a dying tree. He had reached inside, not by impulse, by instruction. His hand had found something solid. Not waste, not paper, but a brick, heavy, damp, wrong. A sound had echoed from behind. Footsteps, deliberate, slow. The mocking teacher, again. He had hidden, not well, but well enough. The teacher's shape had passed by like a ghost, unaware of being seen. The moment had warped. Memory and action had collapsed. The hallway had returned, but twisted. Walls too tall, colors faded. Posters repeated the same message in broken fonts. Wake up. From the far end, movement. The cow again, running, almost gliding. Then the head teacher had appeared. their voice muffled like spoken underwater, words unclear, tone accusing. "What is that on your arms?" The question hadn't been spoken, it had been implanted. He had looked down, read smudged shapes, resembling letters, but never forming words. "I'll change," he had whispered. But no one had heard, because no one had been real. Escape had followed. Not running, drifting. His feet hadn't touched the floor. Then, a house, suburban, dim. The vice principal had walked inside, unaware. He had entered after them, through walls that didn't resist. The bathroom light had glowed softly, a sound of running water steady, endless. He had stood behind the door, waiting, not thinking. The scene had not shown violence, only silence. And then absence. A shape had been left behind, folded clothing, an open mirror, and within the mirror the cow, standing motionless, arms at its sides. Its reflection had moved first, not the suit but the eyes, glowing faintly, pulsing with static. The reflection had not been reversed. It had moved with intention, independent, observing. He had looked away, but the afterimage had lingered behind his eyes. The cow's stare, patient, unblinking. A new day had begun, or at least the shape of one. Sunlight had pierced through clouded glass, too sharp to be natural. Back at the school, the bell had rung, but the halls had stayed empty. Only one voice had broken the silence. "I brought you a sandwich." Words spoken without sound, offered with hands not quite steady. The head teacher had accepted. A moment of trust in a place that had lost all logic. A bite taken, a nod given, but something had been wrong. Not in the food, but in the way the walls had watched. The paint had cracked like dry skin. The clock had ticked out of sync. Then the cow had returned, but no longer stained, no longer frantic. It had walked calmly into the room, its presence bending the air. The head teacher had fallen. No scream, no sound, only a quiet thud. Blood had painted the floor once again, too red, too vivid. The cow's eyes had glowed anew. And then the gorilla had arrived. Not running, not panicked, just witnessing. The building had begun to burn, flames rising from paper, from lockers, from memory. Smoke had slithered along the ceiling, chasing the cow, chasing the gorilla. He had followed, feet moving on instinct. The fire had not touched him. The hallway had warped into a loop. And then it had happened again, that voice. Sharper now, hungrier. "Get up, we're not in primary school." His cheek had pressed once more to the desk. The laughter had returned, familiar, endless, trapped. The classroom had not changed, but it had remembered. Each crack in the wall had shifted slightly. Each poster had leaned in. He had lifted his head again. The teacher's eyes had narrowed. Still dreaming, no answer had formed. Only a chill behind his spine, a pressure behind the eyes. Outside the window, movement, blurred, animal, waiting. The cat, its silhouette had stood at the edge of the field, still, watching, painted in shadow. In the hallway, distant footsteps, padded, heavy, intentional. The gorilla had returned, its arms dragging something unseen. No one else had heard. No one else had looked. They had all continued laughing, trapped in a loop they could no longer sense. He had stood again, legs trembling, chest hollow. The voice in his head had echoed, "You get to choose what happens." But there had never been a choice, only a path, only the next loop. The cow had turned away. The hallway had stretched. The fire had flickered behind the lockers. Somewhere in the distance, the bell had rung again, but the sound had arrived late. Outside, the sky had darkened, not from clouds, but from curtains, as if the world had been staged. and the audience gone. At the far end of the corridor, a mirror had waited. He had walked toward it, each step slower than the last, and in the reflection, the cow, the gorilla, the head teacher, the desk, all waiting, all silent, all still. But in the center, himself, smiling, not cruelly, not kindly, just knowingly, because he had never woken up. Not really. He had only changed desks. The bell had rung again. This time, on time, he had turned. He had sat. He had waited. And behind him, a voice had whispered, "Get up. We're not in primary school."